Good day. My name is Kim Moody, and I'm your host for In the Mood with Kim GC Moody podcast. It's been almost a couple months since I've recorded a podcast, and despite my good intentions to get more regular, that is still my intention, is to get more regular output. But boy, oh boy, it's been a busy time here. So, I wanted to talk to you today about adhesive residency, as I call it, or some critics have called it. And I'll explain that more in a bit here. But, a couple weeks ago, I wrote, actually, to be exact, it was on March 31st, and I'm recording this podcast today on April the 13th, 2026. And on March 31st, I released an article in the Financial Post. And it was about, trying to make economies more attractive to retain their successful taxpayers. And I started off the article using my Bichon Shih Tzu Enzo as an example. Enzo's a great little guy, but as soon as I put him in the yard, sometimes if he's in a playful mood or mischievous mood, he'll just run away. And we don't have a fenced in, a traditional fenced yard. And so sometimes I have to go chase him, and it's not fun. We haven't trained him to to listen on command to come back like that. So he's hit and miss. And yes, that's my fault for not training. But we finally got fed up when he ran to the neighbors one time, and we had to go pick him up a ways away, and it could be a little dangerous too. So we got this GPS fence, and we've been testing it out, and it actually works quite well. So you put this little collar on, and after you've marked out the territory that you want to keep him in, and as soon as he approaches that territorial fence line, it buzzes and makes him uncomfortable. So he's gotten used to now staying within that GPS fence line. And so, I use that as an analogy because Australia and some other countries have toyed with the idea, but Australia used that kind of idea to try to fence in their residents in their tax system. And critics called it adhesive residency. And so what did Australia do? Well, they put out a proposal to change their residency rules, and this was back in 2023. And they did a consultation. That residency is now over. I think it ended in September of 23, if I'm correct, off the top of my head. And what they did, overly simplify, what they're trying to do is make it very easy for people to become a tax resident, not immigration. This is all tax. Still lots of hurdles to become a proper resident of pretty much any country. There's still lots of hurdles. But for tax, they want to make it a lot easier to become an Australian resident and make it very difficult to become a non-resident. And so in the article that I put out on March 31st in the Financial Post, I liken that to the fence. Let's put a fence around these people and make it difficult for them to leave. Like Enzo, is he going to, bust through that electronic fence, that GPS fence? No, because it makes him very, very uncomfortable. And so I thought that was a decent analogy. The other example I used in the article, which I use quite often, is it's very easy to get married, but to get divorced can be a real challenge. And so that kind of analogy as well. And so I basically want to explore, does adhesive residency make sense, especially in today's day and age of capital being very mobile, successful people being very mobile, and my 2 cents is no, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the conclusion is, try to make your economy, if you're a policymaker or a politician, forget the fence or the cage idea. Instead, try to make it so damn attractive to keep your successful people in, and your youth for that matter, which I'll have more to say on that in a minute. But try to keep your successful people and your youth within the confines of your residency, your country's residency, both from an immigration perspective and tax. Make it a no-brainer. You know, so, and why? Well, because then, of course, the country will benefit by increased tax revenues, and there won't be a lot of pressure on the system, or as much pressure, if these people leave. So fast forward a couple weeks later, not even a couple weeks later, and that was the premise of my article, and I was basically saying in that article that Canada's got a lot of work to do to try and keep its successful people in. And I'll have more to say on that in a minute as well. But fast forward a couple weeks later, like I started to say, and the Liberal Party convention happened in Montreal over this last weekend. And we had a panel discussion, or they had a panel discussion. And one of the panelists was a fellow by the name of Patrick Pichette, or Pichette, however you want to pronounce it. And he was the former CFO of Google back in, I think it was 2008 to 2014, in somewhere in that range. And when he retired, he ended up starting some other capital companies and investment, because obviously he had capital to invest, and he now lives apparently in, according to online documentation, he lives in the UK, but he is a Canadian citizen. And so he was musing in this panel about what Canada needs to do to try and stem the brain drain. So let's have a listen to that video, that panel right here. So when you listen to that, are you as shocked as I was? Because basically what it's saying, going back to this article I wrote on March 31st, it's to build a fence or build a cage and trap successful people. Now, he's talking in this case about youth, but really I think the same thing would apply to just otherwise successful people. But let's break apart this and just analyze some of this for a minute here. So first of all, he talks about scrapping the TN program. Well, just to make that very clear, the TN visa program is a US-based program authorized under the CUSMA, Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. And yes, that agreement is under renegotiation right now. So if he wants to scrap it, in air quotes, then I guess you could, negotiate to have that eliminated. But Canada has no ability to outright scrap that program. This is a US-based system which enables professionals and certain qualified people to enter the US for 3 years. And is it as simple as just showing up at the border and paying $30? No. Our firm, Moody's Tax, has a whole immigration department, and there's some work to be done. And yes, it gets to be rather routine in some cases, but ultimately you need to incur legal fees to make sure your application fits the criteria, and then ultimately you'll be able to work legally in the United States. So it's not as simple as just showing up at the border, paying your $30. There's legal stuff that needs to happen behind the scenes to prepare for that, and those fees are either paid directly by the employer, and in some cases the employee directly. So very short shrift given to that, and I thought that was somewhat misleading. But where I found it interesting is that he used a wild estimate of $500,000. Well, first of all, I don't know where he gets that number from. And yes, he was musing out loud. I get that. So I'm not going to hold him to an exact estimate. But there's lots of, so-called research, because I don't think anybody has a great handle on exactly how much the government of Canada, the provinces of Canada contribute to a taxpayer's undergraduate or diploma or postgraduate degree. There's some estimates that it's roughly $100,000 per undergraduate degree, but who knows if that's ultimately correct, because it's not fully funded. If you listen to Patrick Pichette, literally, you would think that the government is subsidizing it 100%, and that's just simply false. And so with that issue aside, it made it sound as if Patrick was all in favor. Well, it wasn't make it sound. He was in favor that if these youngsters want to go work, in the United States or elsewhere, not in Canada, then there should be an exit tax or a penalty in order to make sure that the government of Canada is reimbursed for that investment. Well, that goes back to my original premise, in my March 31st Financial Post article. We want to, as a policy, trap these people or build cages around these youngsters. That seems awfully silly to me, and frankly, just a non-starter. In my view, again, going back to the premise of what we should be doing as a country, we should be incentivizing these youngsters to stay. It should be a no-brainer that they want to stay because the opportunities in Canada are so great. What do most people want, youngsters especially? They want to be able to buy a home, build a life, perhaps have relationships like marriage or common law, have some children, and set down some roots. And Canada is a great place to do that in general, but it's been tough economically in the last 10, 11 years when we've seen our productivity decline like crazy. We've seen tax rates go up. In Ontario, the marginal tax rate, the highest marginal tax rate is 54%. So if you're a successful youngster who's just finished let's say a postgraduate degree in engineering, for example, and you've got offers from around the world, and you've got the ability to get away from our cold winters and make a lot more money with a lot more left in your pocket, because these jurisdictions like the United States don't have 54% tax rates on the high end. Do you not think that that's compelling? That ultimately some people would be thinking about that? For sure. So the short story is that's a silly idea. And in my view, even musing about it with a senior fellow like that is dangerous. And yes, this guy's got roasted online, and I'll have more to say in my article that's coming out tomorrow, April 14th. So by the time this podcast is released, it'll be published. But I just found that so shocking that somebody would muse like that. And it turns out that, after I dug around this is not a new idea. This idea has been around for a long time. And it's shocking to me that people even think that. But because again, why not make Canada so attractive that it's a no-brainer for them to stay, instead of trapping them to have to stay because they can't afford the exit penalty? So I think the idea is silly. It's a non-starter, and practically there'd be a lot of avoidance on it if that ever happened. And what would that avoidance look like? Well, people, successful Canadian youngsters would look to go elsewhere if they thought that they're going to be trapped in Canada. They would get educated in the United States if they could, or Europe, or what have you, which would further harm, Canada in general. People would be looking to leave now. If that idea ever had legs, it wouldn't be just youngsters that would be exiting. It would be currently successful people as well. And on that point, let me talk about that. Although Mr. Pichette didn't talk exactly about successful people leaving Canada, the two issues are tied together. Right now we have a lot of successful entrepreneurs or people that have built their wealth and monetized and are redeploying their capital in Canada for the most part. There's unfortunately a lot of those successful people and entrepreneurs that are leaving. And I've written many, many times in the Financial Post about just ringing the alarm bell about, hey, do you guys understand, Canadians, that a lot of successful people have had it? The rhetoric of tax the rich and, attacking success and treating wealth as some sort of social justice issue, as opposed to looking at it as a success agent to create more opportunity and more jobs. That kind of rhetoric really, it does push people, especially when lifestyle, which is usually the number one consideration, lifestyle and and warmer weather. When you combine those lifestyle objectives with rhetoric that ultimately attacks success, oftentimes it's a push. I often say when I publicly speak on this topic, the first 23 years of my career, I might have had maybe a dozen files that I worked on where Canadians were leaving Canada. Now, I call those files departure tax files, and I'll explain that in a minute. But fast forward to 2015 forward, and especially the last, I would say 6-7 years, and in particular the last couple years and the last year with Mr. Carney at the helm, we've seen just an explosion of departure tax files. And the number of files that myself and my colleagues have worked on is well over, probably approaching 1,200 right now, with the wealth attached to that into the tens of billions of dollars. Now, will you see that in the Statistics Canada reports? No, you won't. A lot of this information is private and will never be disclosed. But I'm telling you, the wealth depletion and wealth exodus is real. And that's not good for Canada. It's not good because ultimately it's a loss of revenues, it's a loss of talent, it's a loss of wealth creation, job creators. And we need, again, to make Canada attractive to these successful people to stay so that they can redeploy their capital for the benefit of all Canadians. Unfortunately, though, these kinds of people get vilified and it's just not helpful. So what happens when people leave Canada? Currently, successful people leave Canada. Well, there's a departure tax, as I've already kind of alluded to. And in my Financial Post article of April 14th, I describe it. But very generally, we have a deemed disposition at fair market value. And I've done a podcast on this, I think a couple of years ago. So you can scroll through the episodes and look for departure tax matters, like people becoming a non-resident Canada. But the general rule is all of your assets are deemed disposed of at fair market value. And if there's any resulting gains, even though those gains haven't been monetized yet, then there's a resulting tax that needs to be paid. Now, there are exceptions to those rules, and they come in 5 buckets of exceptions, but the most common exceptions are Canadian real estate held personally and registered assets like RSPs. And the reason why those are exceptions to the deemed disposition rule when you become a non-resident is because Canada will eventually get their pound of flesh. When you sell Canadian dirt, Canada has the first right to tax that, and they will. When you withdraw from your RSPs or your RIFs, Canada imposes a withholding tax. And so there's those buckets of exceptions. Now there's a bunch of other exceptions. They get rather technical. I won't get into them today. But Canada does tax you on the way out. And in addition, it will continue to tax Canadian source income. So if you have a private company and it owns a bunch of assets, well, that could be a problem because your shares, which is what you hold personally, are deemed disposed of at fair market value. But if you start withdrawing the underlying assets, well, that's dividends, and those will be taxed again. And when those are taxed as a non-resident, there's a withholding tax. It starts at 25%, and it can be reduced depending on where you're living if Canada has a tax treaty with that country. And so most countries that Canada has a treaty with, like the United States, will reduce that 25% rate on dividends to 15%. But even then, that's still a fair amount of money that ultimately you're going to end up paying tax on, especially since you had a departure tax on the original share. So you have to really plan for double tax exposure and see if you can mitigate it on the way out. It gets a little complicated. And so, there's unfortunately a rhetoric out there that, successful Canadians can leave Canada easily. Well, no, it's not easy. And these files that we work on, that's the challenge in many cases, is to try to minimize the tax if we can, but just as importantly, look for ways to minimize or eliminate long-term double taxation. And so Canada does have indeed a vested interest in leaving. It's not even a vested interest, it's just they participate aggressively from a tax perspective when people leave Canada. But let's go back to the youth, that Mr. Pichette was talking about. Do most youth who just come out of a graduate school or even an undergraduate, or maybe they're a doctor, or a lawyer or an accountant that wants to move to the United States and they just got designated or qualified, do they typically have a lot of wealth? The answer is no. Typically they don't, unless somehow there's an inheritance, or there's always exceptions to the rules, of course. But in general, most youngsters will not have a lot of money. And so this departure tax that would apply to successful people, that financially successful people, wouldn't apply to them because they just don't have a lot of wealth. And so what Mr. Pichet's proposal is, well, we're going to tax them on the way out by recovering the cost that the governments have paid or contributed to their education. Again, I've already said this, but I'll repeat it. I find that silly that someone even thinks that that's rational. Now, if Mr. Pichette has already repaid the cost of his education, then good for him, because at least he put his money where his mouth is. But I find a lot of people who have these ideas are not willing to put their money where their mouth is, because it's expensive. Now, Mr. Pichette, I'm sure, is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know, obviously. He could be worth certainly tens of millions, not hundreds. But having said that, it's just an idea that has no legs in my view. So what should we be doing instead? Well, as I mentioned, we should be making Canada a much more attractive place to be. And it starts with, getting government out of the way. We have government involved in a lot of things these days. We've got apparently we're building a whole bunch of homes with huge speed. Well, I'm not seeing it, but we have a, new housing mandate, which is just another bureaucracy in my view. We have, MOUs with Alberta, the Alberta government, to try to build a pipeline. Well, we're long past the April 1st deadline to get that done. Time will tell whether or not we get a pipeline. And it really is troublesome to see government get in the way with a bunch of regulation, a bunch of bureaucracy. So we need to get rid of that, in my view, to really incentivize the job creators, the wealth creators, to take risks, to invest in Canada and attract foreign capital, and not be hamstrung by regulatory approval that takes forever. And from a tax perspective, which of course is my area of expertise, we need big bang tax reform, as Jack Mintz calls it. With his colleagues, he wrote a very good piece that I've written about in the Financial Post as well, that's published on CD Howe's, the think tank CD Howe's website. And it is entitled Big Bang Tax Reform. And basically what he's saying, and it is worthwhile, if you're interested in this topic, you should Google CD Howe, Jack Mintz, Big Bang Tax Reform, and you'll find it. But he's talking about significantly reducing corporate tax rates, or having a system like Estonia, where if a company reinvests its capital back into Estonia, there's no tax until that money is distributed from the corporation, either directly or indirectly. Now, Jack and his colleagues come up with a Canadian version of that, and I think it's very worthwhile. Can you imagine that if a company doesn't have to pay corporate tax until it distributes its money, and that money is reinvested in Canadian businesses and Canadian jobs, how much of a incentivization that would be to grow? I think that would be very good, especially given that corporate tax is not as important. It's important as a revenue generator, no question about it, but roughly it represents 18% of all Canadian federal revenues. The personal tax is roughly anywhere from 45 to 47%, depending on the year. So, that's the huge amount of tax revenue is personal tax, but corporate tax is way down. GST is in the neighborhood of off the top of my head, about 12% or so. I stand to be corrected on that. I don't have the stats in front of me. But the bottom line is, could a system be developed, like Jack said, where you don't eliminate corporate tax revenues to zero, but you defer them and combine that with significant government expenditure cuts? I think that would be certainly incentivization to help Canada bounce back or provide a big bang, as Jack says, to Canada's economy overall. He also talks about, in the Big Bang tax reform, reducing Canada's personal rates. I personally think that the highest personal tax rate, combined federal and provincial, should be no more than 45%. Having provinces like Ontario, British Columbia, the Atlantic provinces, Quebec, where it's 54%, I find that it just egregious and a disincentive for people to reinvest their capital and to take jobs and grow success. So that needs to come down, and he talks about that. He also talks about simplification in Big Bang tax reform. Instead of having all these boutique tax credits, and he talks about simplifying it and combining it into one so-called super credit and eliminating a lot of the other boutiques. I love that idea. I mean, we can debate on how much that exemption should be. In my view, it should be big enough to eliminate the working poor from paying personal income tax. But long story short is simplification is certainly an objective that we should be striving towards. I love the idea of Estonia type tax because it provides that capital gains deferral. I won't repeat myself, but I get excited about that because I do think that is a great idea. So I could go on, but I think it's time to conclude this podcast and say that I'll end where I started from, which is, we can't have a system where adhesive residency or building fences is the way to keep successful people in Canada. That is nonsensical, especially in this mobile world where capital flows freely and quickly. And when successful people generally have the ability to go quickly as well. Shutting down the TN program, for example, is nonsensical and a silly idea. And it'll cause, even if you could do it, that it would cause much more harm than good. So let's not build fences as a country. Let's make Canada so damn attractive. So that's my message for today. How do we get this done? Well, spreading the message. If you find this message compelling, share this podcast. Subscribe for my podcast link and my other In the Mood content. We can't be enamored by just simply having a smart person at the helm. We need smart policies that are carried out with diligence and informed consent, which maybe I will digress and talk lastly that, I've been on the pulpit for quite some time now that I think Canadians in general need to improve their financial literacy. It's shocking to me how little Canadians understand their own finances and how governments run. And I'm not saying, for example, that I'm the smartest person in the room, because I'm not. But do I take action to understand my finances, to understand how our country runs and the consequences of not being run correctly or better? Yes, I do. Which all leads to, if I have better improved financial literacy, or if you do, you're going to make better informed choices, both on your personal finances and at the ballot box. Because do we want people running our country that have no clue about economics and instead just, run and make decisions based upon what feels good? No. We need to protect Canada, its resources, its economic potential for our next generation and for the generations after that. In other words, we need to plant acorns that can grow into the mighty oak tree. And that's been a mantra I've used for quite some time, and I'll continue. So with that, thanks for listening. Until next time, bye now.